Welcome to the Growing in Grace podcast, where you can listen in on some casual conversation about the good news of Jesus without all of the inconsistent religious double talk. If you've ever struggled with feelings of hopelessness, guilt, and despair, or wondered if you're really right with God, it's time to discover the true freedom that comes with the gospel of unlimited and overflowing grace.
The Growing in Grace podcast, growingingrace.org. 17 years of the Growing in Grace podcast. Now we have officially passed that amount. And last week we had our first where we have decided to break the 14-minute rule permanently here on the Growing in Grace podcast. Not that we're going to, like you said at the end of last week, not that we're going to be making it extra long or anything like that, and it might be shorter, it might be longer, but we decided that we don't need to stick to the exact 14-minute thing, and so we are celebrating here 17 years of the podcast, something that neither you and I, when we started talking about grace together back in the mid-90s, we didn't think, well, and we were both in radio. That's where we met, Cap, as we met in a Christian hit radio station where I had started as a volunteer back in 1994. You were the program director, and you were learning at that time, or shortly after I started there, you were beginning to learn some things about grace through a local pastor and church. You had started sharing those things with me, and then we started talking about all these things together. And even so, even though we were in radio, there was never really any idea and any plan to start any sort of a radio program based upon any of this, but we were asked by a friend, well, at the time, someone I had just met on the internet, if we would do a program about the grace of God for an internet radio station, and I asked you if you would join me because I didn't want to do it by myself, and then so we started that, and it became a podcast. It's what I started posting it on a website. And this is back then, I had questions like, what's a podcast? I do a Growing in Grace podcast. What's a podcast? How do I find out about your podcast? And people didn't know what a podcast was. My mom asked me.
Did we even call it a podcast in the early days?
Not at first. No, it was a radio program that was on the internet radio station. And then it became a podcast. I heard the word podcast. I don't think I had even heard the word podcast at the time that we started this. And then I began hearing about podcasts, and I'm like, I guess that's what we're doing. And but now, of course, you've got lots of podcasts all over the world, which is a great thing. But it's just interesting that we had never even heard of anything like that. And I think after the internet radio thing, basically, I would just, this wasn't really a podcast. I would just upload each episode to a server, and I had a website, and each week I would just add the next episode, and that's pretty much how that started. and then eventually it became, the Growing in Grace podcast. Interesting.
Yeah, Joel has done all the work for that. I just sort of feel like I've been along for the ride here in some ways. I know we do the podcast together and we share it and working off of each other. I want to just preface what I'm about to say with this. I'm not trying to be political, but when you think of Rush Limbaugh, how he could sit there day in and day out, all of those years just talking. You mentioned last week how you were a quiet person. And I'm quiet by nature, too. There was something about getting on the radio where I could just, flip a switch and be the radio guy. But, Raj could just sit there day after day. He didn't really want anybody else on there. He had a few guests once in a while, but generally speaking, it was just him talking day in and day out. And then after he passed, there was another podcast that in some locations in the country filled his time slot. And those were two guys talking, kind of like what you and I do here about grace. They were talking about political stuff. And to me, that this format for us has been so beneficial because it would be easy for either one of us to get on and talk for 5, 10, or 15 minutes or whatever the podcast length is and, share our heart about different things that are on our mind, kind of like what we do when we post something in writing on social media. But there's just something about working off of each other it's been helpful. And what's unique about it, I think, Joel, is it's very hard. It would be very hard for me to have done this with anybody else, because you see, it was so organic, the way we met, the way that I was coming into an understanding of grace in a way that just blew my mind. And I started sharing with you, and you you latched onto it instantly. And as you said last week, we would have these conversations between ourselves for nearly a decade. Also learning from a pastor who had transitioned into grace. And when this podcast opportunity came along, we were already kind of established with each other. We knew each other. We knew why we thought the way we thought. I mean, we have a unique chemistry, I think, to be able, because it's not like we spend a lot of time together, even though we live in the same town. We have our lives, we do our jobs, we have our families, and then we do this podcast. But I think we know each other almost as well as anybody else in our lives from a spiritual perspective. And on those rare occasions where we might not always see everything just exactly the same, and you probably wouldn't even recognize it on the podcast because we just hardly ever get into any of that. But even if there are times where we see things from a slightly different perspective, and it's a very small percentage of the time, we have enough respect for each other to just accept that and move on, because nobody has this down to a perfect science. Science isn't perfect. We've learned that a lot over the last couple of years, haven't we? And so there's nobody who's going to have a perfect understanding of the truth. That's why we talk these things out and provide a perspective and allow, hopefully, the Spirit of God to lead people in a way, because, sometimes the Spirit of God, the way he teaches, he'll teach people where they're at. And help with their understanding on where they're at the time. And so if we can help contribute something toward that, the Spirit is really going to be your teacher.
Right, yeah, and that's really what it is. It's, people might call us grace teachers. Sometimes people, like on social media, will call me pastor, and I'm like, it's not really how I think of myself, but nevertheless, no matter what teacher is out there, gifted as a teacher. Maybe it's their place in the body of Christ as a teacher, but it's the Holy Spirit that's really the ultimate teacher. So no matter if we say something or somebody else says something, definitely, don't take it as the solid truth, because the solid truth is given by the Holy Spirit. But I kind of
I've been called worse than pastor.
Yeah.
Somebody called me Harry the other day. Harry Tick or something like that.
Yeah, that's one we get. We've had that accusation quite often too. I was called an agent of Satan the other day. Yesterday, actually. Yep, an agent of Satan, a deceiver. That type of thing. And you just kind of just roll with it. It doesn't really matter, because what people say doesn't define who we are, doesn't define who I am or who you are. You just kind of let some of that just roll off your back. But last week I kind of shared about how this is a God thing, how this whole thing came about. I just wanted to briefly share. I think it's been a while since I've talked about how I met you and how all this came about. But it's, to me, every time I look back on my life and I think of what God has done, this just always comes to my memory, just always comes to my mind, and I think about this often. I had no plans to be in radio. I had no plans to do any talking. In fact, in 1993, I had made a list of things that I might want to do with my life. I was kind of fresh in my walk with the Lord. I mean, I've been a believer all my life, as far back as I can remember, but the Lord did a big thing with me back in 92. And then in 93, I made this list, and it was all introverted stuff, like behind the scenes at a radio station or TV station, like behind a camera where no one can see me. I mean, that's kind of what I thought. Or just quietly working in an office in a coffee shop, just behind the scenes. A park ranger. And in my mind, it was someone, I would be way out in the boonies, just all by myself. I mean, that was my thought. All these things that I thought I might want to do would be way introverted types of things. Definitely not in front of a microphone, not in front of a camera, anything like that. So then in 94, I had a friend who had gone down to, we live in Iowa, and so just southwest of us is, just south of us is Missouri, and you got Kansas City there on the west side of Missouri. And a friend had gone to school, Christian college, And so I would go down and visit him every once in a while. I was a young, single guy. But he wouldn't have gotten to go to this college. This is a big part of the story. He was short on money. Back then, we were young, single, had no money. He needed a certain amount of money, like $100 or $300. I can't remember what it was, in order to be able to move down there and attend this thing. On the day where the deadline was that he needed the money, out of the blue, somebody gave him exactly what he needed. So he was able to go and attend this school. And so I would go visit him from time to time. And he had some friends down there who I also became friends with. So when I would go down there every once in a while, I would hang out with them. And it just so happened that before my wife and I were married, we had broken up a couple times and gotten back together. Well, during one of the times that we were broken up, I thought, I'll go down and see these friends. So I wouldn't have done this if my wife and I hadn't broken up at this time. So I went down to see them. And we're on our way to go see a Kansas City Royals baseball game. And they are talking about how there's a lack of Christian radio geared toward kids in Kansas City. This is back in '94. And I said, you know what? I've heard of this radio station up in Waterloo. And I might just go up there and find out if I can get any information on how to start something like this. I mean, I had no intention of myself doing it, of starting a station. But I thought, I'll see if I can get some information. So if not for that conversation, if not for my wife and I have been broken up at that time, if not for my friend having received exactly what he needed to go there, that never would have happened. I never would have come back up to Waterloo. I went up to the radio station to find out, what information can you guys give me about starting a radio station? Well, he never gave me any information, not you, but the other Mike that was up there. But he said, we're looking for a couple of volunteer DJs. And inside, I just kind of laughed, because of what I just said about...
Kind of like Sarah?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I guess if you think about it that way, I laugh because I'm like, that's not me. No, behind the scenes, not in front of a microphone. But then as I left, in my heart, I just felt this tug that I could not explain. And so I went home, I thought about this, and I thought, no. I said, no, I can't do this. It's not me. But then I just kept feeling this tug. And so that's how I came back up, and I talked to you that time. I went up there with a friend who was also going to inquire about this, and he never ended up doing it. But anyway, so I went up there, talked to you. You were about to go on vacation, so you did a vacation thing. I came back up. We trained. I trained for 3 days, 2 hours each day, and then you threw me on the air, and then that's how that all came about. But it's just all that to say, it was such a God thing. I never would have planned any of those steps. I never would have planned any of it. Then like within a year, probably even sooner than that, you started sharing the grace of God with me, and that's leads us up to the time that we started talking about grace and the podcast and everything. So anyway, I just thought I would share that because to me, that's just a big thing.
But yeah, that kind of goes back to what I said I think it was last week that I said that you look back and you see God orchestrating things. Even sometimes on our podcast, we go back, we listen, and we think, man, I don't even remember saying that.
Right.
And you think, hey, we sounded better than I thought when we were recording. I mean, this is really good stuff. And we just don't have that sometimes within us. Well, we do, but it's not just us coming up with stuff sometimes. And that's the way it is. That's the way it is when the Spirit of God is at work. And he works with people's personalities too. That's what makes it all so unique. But yeah, so imagine any of those steps getting missed, any of those things not happening. We have no podcast. We have no book called Clash of the Covenants. We have none of that. And you and I both know from the people we've heard from, and we hear, having been in radio, we hear from a very small, I mean literally a sliver of a percentage of people will actually take the time to communicate that they're out there for whatever reason. And I get it. I usually wouldn't do that either, even though I'm listening and appreciating something or watching something. It is just not something I normally would do. And so, but that small percentage that we have heard from, it's been it's been amazing. Even if it's just a few sentences, sometimes a full page where somebody's telling us their story of how they came to grace, it means so much to us when you let us know that. Or if the podcast has been a blessing to you, it encourages us and keeps us going.
It sure does. And it's been interesting because we've posted it on a website, which is based on, growingingrace.org is based upon, right now anyway, Blogger. And so people can comment there, but we've hardly ever gotten any comments there. But about 10 years ago or so, I started posting it on YouTube, just the audio, along with a picture, the logo. And we get more comments there, I think, than anywhere else. And I don't always have time to respond to everything, but we appreciate everything, every email, every comment, on Facebook too, on Twitter. I sure appreciate everything. By the way, I'm at Grace Roots on Twitter, and I don't spend much time there, but just in case anyone wants to know. So anyway, this has been good. I mean, I've really enjoyed reminiscing.
Hey, can we do this one more week?
Sure, let's go ahead and do it.
I mean, I want to reflect on more of the content of what we've been discussing over the last 17 years.
I would love to do that, definitely. So let's do that one more week of our 17th anniversary of the Growing in Grace podcast. So stick with us next week.
This has been Growing in Grace with Mike Kapler and Joel Brieseke, heard online through various internet sources around the world each week. Access past programs by visiting growingingrace.org. Share it with a friend and listen again next week for more Growing in Grace.